how do I integrate specialty bars into program design? So one of the options you can do is, if you're more of a entry-level trainee and you want to get better on the primary movements with the barbell, so keep the barbell in the A series to keep rehearsing your technique to the point where you feel very efficient doing that barbell exercise. But in the meanwhile, in the B series, especially on intensification phases, then it's not a bad thing at this point to introduce specialty bars. Like, I love the thick grip bars, like the 3-inch thick. In the B series, I'll usually do a close grip variation, simply because we know that close grip strength development radiates to a wider grip. So the close grip work you're doing in the B series translates in better performance on your primary movement with the A series using a mid grip. Or if, for example, you have somebody who has like, let's say, messed up shoulders, but you still want to overload with barbell work, well then, like Swiss bars or football bars, where you're using a neutral or semi-pronated grip, will be a little easier on the shoulders. But so these are ways that you can use a specialty bars to overload the movements. But yeah, like I said, for the most part, B series, close grip variations of specialty bars, that's how I like to introduce it. Now, once you get to a higher level, now it's not a bad thing to use specialty bars on the prime movement to create a different stimulus. So like, if you've adapted to a weight, like you've been stalling at a certain weight on a specific lift for a while, now if you use that lift and you interject the specialty bars onto it, sometimes this change is good enough because you're recruiting different motor units to break through that strength plateau and just keep progressing after, once you get back to a regular barbell work. So overall, that's how I would use specialty bars. So what do you do with your training if you're using the PRIMEIGHT template, but you have a new client that cannot squat or deadlift? To me, it's pretty simple. If you cannot squat or deadlift, like, first of all, you always have them try, because you want to see how they're moving, what they're doing on the lift. But if they can't do it, all I do is I regress the level of difficulty of the movement to a point where the client is able to do something. For example, a client might not be able to do a proper back squat with feet on the ground, but they might be able to do a quad squat with a 30-degree heel elevation. Or they might not be able to do a squat with a barbell on their back, but they might be able to do a Zercher squat, for example. So it's just a question of regressing and finding what suits them and give them the level of exercise that they can tolerate. It's the same thing on deadlift. Like, a lot of people, they struggle on deadlift because they don't have the range of motion to get in the bottom position and pull the barbell from 8 inches from the ground. So to me, if that's your issue, all you do is, now you put the deadlift, you do the deadlift inside a power rack, and you restrict the range of motion to the level they can do. And over time, you reduce or you decrease the height of the power racks, so the range of motion progresses to the point where eventually you can do it on the floor. So I'm not a fan of going away from the movement, because I find that, like, for example, a lot of coaches would get away from squat or deadlift, and then they would have their client do like split squats and step ups for X amount of time. Now the thing is, you can become really good at step ups and split squats, but now you reintroduce the squat or the deadlift, now you still need to learn that movement. So I don't like that waste of time. I think you're better off starting the movement with a regression, taking what the client gives you. In the meanwhile, you work on the step up and split squat variations, and then eventually they'll be able to do the movement. And I find that the rate of success or the rate of progress is much faster doing it this way. In my opinion, does the overhead press respond well to compensatory acceleration training? Yes, for sure. So I'm a huge fan of compensatory acceleration training. Another term that I use is intended maximal concentric acceleration. It's basically the same thing. It's all about having the intent to accelerate the load concentrically as much as you can, irrespective of the actual load and the actual velocity. If you're training at 90% of 1 RM and you try to accelerate the load concentrically as fast as you can, now at 90%, obviously the load is so heavy that the actual barbell speed won't be that high, but the intent of trying to accelerate has been shown to increase the amount of high threshold motor units used in the movement. And as we know, high threshold motor units have more potential for growth than slow twitch fibers. So to me, any technique or method that allows me to tap into more high threshold motor units, I'll use anytime, because the upsides of it, especially in the long run, are so much greater. I don't think that the overhead press is different than the other press, and the CAT system will definitely yield benefits. How would I program and periodize for an entire football team during the off season? I could parallel this to when I consulted with the St. Louis Cardinals. So I was in charge of writing the programs for the entire team, plus some of the farm teams, athletes, and on and on. So overall, it was like 76 players. And the way I did it, because for those who follow me, you know that I'm not a huge fan of the approach, you're this position, you should train this way. Or like, to me, it's more of a question of the individual athlete. And then you train the individual athlete in its biggest weakness. Now, obviously, it needs to make sense for the sport they're playing. I'm not saying that. But that, to me, the individual athlete and their strengths and weaknesses is what I think is the most important thing. So what I did is I assessed all the players, and then I classified them in 5 groups. And the groups were separated by, let's say you had a hip group, for example. So let's say that group, the hip joint was more fragile, or they lacked a lot of mobility. I had a shoulder group, so people who have like shoulder instability, and that's their main predetermining factor of lack of performance. So I grouped them in groups like this based on weaknesses, especially structural balance weaknesses, especially if you start off. Like, so that was my first year, and the team was so banged up that I figured that focusing more on structural imbalances would be a bigger upside than like mostly like focusing on like speed strength or stuff like that. Like, they weren't at that level where that really mattered. But it doesn't matter, no matter what it is. Even if they were at a level where now you do want to look at explosive strength and reactive strength, you still need to assess, and then you would just create different groups with these things in mind, and you would put these players in each of these 5 groups. So to me, that would be a little bit more effective for overall training than just do like a defensive back group, a running back group. Like, although it makes a lot of sense, but you'll quick realize once you assess the athlete across all positions that not all running backs have the same strengths and weaknesses or need the same things to train. So that's why, to me, it made more sense to dispatch them in groups, like I said, that were more structural and balance dominant. Do I use high frequency full body training 3 to 5 times a week? Yes, I use this with especially body composition blocks, where the focus is 100% on decreasing body fat. So let's say bringing somebody who's 23-24% body fat down to the 10 to 12 mark. For this group, I believe at full body you get a little bit more bang for your buck, because it's just much more metabolically demanding. Like, usually 4 times seems to be the sweet spot for most. So like Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, full body sessions. The more advanced they are, the more variations I will have, to a point where somebody really advanced, the 4 full body sessions would be completely different in structure. But 5, you can do 5. I've done 5 a few times. But you'll notice that a lot of people It's kind of like the threshold where they won't be able to recover, especially the lower body. So if you can't recover and the load decreases, then you're kind of pulling away of your performance goals of improving gut body composition. So I would rarely push to 5, but usually 3 to 4 is a non-issue. Can you repeat a limiting lift macro cycle more than once in a year if a client has a hard time progressing that lift? Yes, 100%. So what you can do, like the only one, like you can even repeat back-to-back macros if you need to. The only one I would never do that is the overhead press, simply because the overhead press is the only lift where your A series primary exercise for the entire 12 week you will train every phase. So because of that, the pattern overload syndrome issues you can get if you were to do 24 weeks straight of overhead press is just too much. So what I would do for overhead is I would start with a overhead macro, then the next macro I would move to incline press. Now we know that angles above with our upper body pressing help angles below, but the problem is there's nothing above overhead obviously, but at least the incline is the closest. So you're still training an angle that's relatively weaker compared to your bench or dip angle, but it's still different enough of the overhead that you're not affecting the recovery curve of the overhead. And then macrocycle 3, now you can get back to another overhead press macrocycle. So this you can do. Now all the other lifts, incline, bench, squat, blah, 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 you could do back-to-back macros, no problem, that's doable. But for the most part though, like you'll notice, if the plan is well adjusted, if it's well programmed, by the time you're done with a 12-week macro, unless you have like a drastic discrepancy on a lift, most of the time when you reassess the lift at the end of that macro, there's going to be something else now that will become the limiting lift. That's one thing to consider as well. How long does it take to get back to your previous strength level after a long break? This really depends. The more advanced you are, the longer you've been training, the longer it takes to drop performance, but the faster you can regain that performance if dropped. But also, it's lift dependent. So, for example, the squat, which is such a technical, it's a groove type of movement. Mobility is really important. If you get away from the squat for like a month, I guarantee you coming back, it's going to feel awkward. It might take you like 3 to maybe 6 weeks to just get back to proper squatting groove and to the loads you were using before. But on the flip side, like a movement that's technically a little less complex, like the deadlift, for example, you might be able to regain all of your strength in 3 weeks. Okay, it's much faster. But just keep in mind, generally speaking, the longer you've been training, the faster you can regain. And then if you haven't been training for a while, if you're a beginner and you just started training, so let's say you've been training for 3 months and you've made some gains, but you're a beginner, and then you stop for 3 weeks, you have to start all over again. And it might take you another maybe 6 or 8 weeks to get back to where you were. Okay, so that's the consideration to take, but a definite time frame, it's hard to say.